Briahna, welcome to the show. It's so great to see you.
It's a real pleasure to be reunited with you, Kim, since we last were side by side
Oh
on The
man,
Hills Rising.
what in the world? Little birds have told me, of course I still have connections at Rising. I'm sure, we all do, right, from having been there. Some people have told me that they believe that they were just waiting for a reason to let you go because they were just not thrilled with all of the Israel. You were doing such a great job of talking about Israel, talking about the Palestinians, but they weren't really hot for that apparently. So they were just looking for a reason. Did they ever take you aside and say anything to you?
No, so I think I have been vocal since the beginning, but especially after Katie Halper was fired or her contract, they chose not to work with her anymore after
Right.
she did a radar on Israel, calling it an apartheid state that they would not allow to air. Ever since then, I've been very open about the extent to which my employment there was contingent on my ability to truthfully cover the news, including any critique of Israel that is obviously factually supported and true, without there being any pushback. And really, doing Rising at all was pitched to me as a place where I could have a platform to speak to a more ideologically diverse audience that I might have on my own podcast, and talk about issues that normally don't get a big airing in a corporate media space. So they understood that that was the entire draw for me. And I think Robbie in particular really understood that I wasn't someone who was there for purely financial motives, that I was willing to walk away. And Robbie, as you know, has really been through it in terms of different hosts coming in and out and
Well,
having to
they keep pushing us out.
exactly,
Poor Robbie.
exactly. And I do think he did a lot of work to try to insulate me from the pressures. When I said this was a problem, I think that he frankly tried to not let me in on all of the pressures he was experiencing as someone who was like a full-time employee there as opposed to a contract employee about the messaging of the show.
Let's talk about that for a second. So Robbie is now an actual employee of Nexstar.
Yeah, as I understand
Yeah,
it, yeah.
yeah. And they never. So did they ever offer you a contract to become an employee?
Yes. So they wanted me to. And I had some reservations about things exactly like this. Am I going to be precluded from speaking out because of an NDA if I sign on to a longer term contract? Am I going to be precluded from walking away if and when they do start exerting more editorial control over me because I've signed a contract? I really came on to Rising feeling like it was a temporary thing. They needed someone to fill in. They were struggling to find balance with the show and having an in-person left chair host for Robbie. And it just kind of became over time a regular gig. They had to convince me to go from 3 days to four, for instance, and be
Yeah,
more of a full-time presence on the show. So for me, it was important to be able to maintain a degree of independence because especially since the Katie Halper debacle, and
yeah,
also, of course, what happened to you, which was what, like a month or two into my tenure there. It was pretty early.
yeah. Early on.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I didn't want to be precluded from telling the truth about what I very strongly believed ultimately would happen.
yeah. I'm surprised that same with me and with you that they weren't offering us. Well, for me, they never really offered me employment. I mean, we were in the middle of a contract negotiation right when everything had happened, and we actually had finalized that contract negotiation, but I still wasn't going to be an employee of the company. They actually never offered me the same deal that they offered Robbie. I found that to be very interesting that they wanted to keep us, they were willing. What I found the most fascinating was that they'd stick us, on the banners, on
Right.
the imagery, like as if, obviously you're a main host of the show, right? But still not willing to commit. Like the way it was I was literally a day by day. I mean, like every day was a new day, and there was no agreement for longer than a day. I mean, at least for my deal, it was just every day, day by day, whether or not we do it. And they still stuck me front and
Yeah.
center on everything. Like they're willing to brand. And it was that to me is like an interesting business strategy of like, we'll use you for as long as we like you. And then when we don't like you, we don't have to use you anymore,
I mean, in
but we'll
your
use
case
you.
in particular, Kim, I'm curious. I mean, again, I wasn't as, because I was never like a full-time employee, I was never as involved in like the back deal workings, but I remember vividly, at least from my perspective, the lead up to them, um, with departing ways from you on the
Right.
show. Because I remember I didn't host Mondays at the time. I was Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And I remember getting a call over the weekend asking if I wanted to come in on Monday because there was this opportunity to interview Dr. Fauci. Now, I didn't especially want to, mostly because I'm lazy and didn't want to work work on a Monday. I had my own show to
Right.
do and other things to do. But only in retrospect did I realize that they were trying to have me instead of you, and to
Yeah.
not give you the opportunity to do the interview that frankly the audience all wants to see, as someone who was really kind of a leading voice on interrogating some of the narratives that were out there, and which are much more common now but weren't back then,
Right.
about the truth of COVID, CDC recommendations, the lab leak, and all of that.
Right.
So, to me, it always felt like, and I wonder what your perspective was, that they were so apprehensive about your political vision and the politics that you brought to the show around COVID in particular, that they were unwilling to tether themselves to you. And I started to feel that way when Israel became the main news story after October 7th about the relationship with me as well.
Yeah, there was always, the upper management in particular. I mean, when I was there for the year I was there, there were like no adults in the room.
Mm,
It was like this interesting time and opportunity when Nexstar had just purchased it. When I was brought on board, Nexstar didn't own it yet. They bought it within 1 month of me coming on board, and Jimmy Finkelstein, who owned the place, called me. He was the one who brought me on,
mm,
and then he calls me and he says, "Sorry, but I've sold it now to Nexstar, and I don't know what they're going to do, but I'm just letting that I've sold the place." Um, when he sold it, luckily Nexstar didn't really know what to do with Rising, and they were too busy with the rest of the Hill. They were integrating themselves and figuring out and kind of moving the Hill over to their systems and whatnot. So it took them about a year before they finally put any attention on Rising whatsoever. So there was like a year where there was like no upper management. There were no adults in the room, really. We were just left to do whatever we wanted to do. And so I got lucky. I think that had Nexstar been involved prior to that point, I would not have been able to talk about the things that they would have gotten rid of me in some way much earlier than they did.
yeah.
They would have just said, "We don't even want this person on the show." And I know that they would have done that because there were people that were in the upper management of the Hill, not on the Rising side, but of the actual publication, who voiced regularly that I
Yes.
was a conspiracy theorist. They went to the Daily Beast,
Yes,
they
same.
yeah,
There
and
was a
that
Daily Beast hit piece on me, I think maybe
I
a
saw
month
that.
or two ago,
Yeah,
where people at the Hill, insiders at the Hill, say that there are all these people who have problems with her, etc. So there
yeah.
was stuff percolating, and then there was more explicit stuff. Like eventually, it came out that I kept asking, well, why aren't we booking Norm Finkelstein? He is the preeminent voice on Gaza.
Right,
He
yeah,
literally wrote the book that's behind me on the shelf called Gaza. When he comes on the show, there's gangbuster numbers. When you see him on everybody else's programming, why wouldn't we have him on? And I kept just kind of getting ignored until eventually, I think Robbie admitted to me that there's a moratorium on having him on because he is a quote unquote Holocaust denier. I mean,
oh, right, yeah,
these are the kind of signals I was slowly starting to get. Not to mention the fact, I think, in the bigger picture scheme of things, I think to your point, there has never been a comfort level of the Hill as a kind of straight down the middle media institution with what Rising was as a show and as a
yeah,
phenomenon that Crystal and Sagar invented and put together. And they had this
right.
runaway success on their hands, but tonally it was very different from what was happening on the Hill. And there was
Right,
almost this embarrassment about what to do with us. They couldn't shut it down because it was successful,
right.
but they also were frankly embarrassed, it seemed,
Yeah,
by
yeah.
us.
They totally were, and that's really ultimately what happened was that the populism movement took hold, and Crystal and Sagar did they had a different perspective than mainstream, and that populist vision just there's obviously a huge appetite for that, and there's some people in that space, like Joe Rogan being one, who, latches on to that narrative that it's just a way of thinking that I think the American people have moved towards. And the establishment media hasn't been able to figure that out. Well, they
Yeah.
know it's happening. They just want to keep labeling it as conspiracy theory. But The Hill is kind of that interesting. They're in this kind of middle space where they're like, well, we're not totally mainstream, but we're also we're not really sure if we want to go in that direction either. So
Yeah.
they really did
Yeah.
have. I think though Finkelstein, when he owned the place, Jimmy
Yeah.
Finkelstein, when he owned the place, I think he was much more willing to go in that direction. He loved that
Yep.
direction, and he was like, "Yeah, let's do it.
That's
This
my
is where
impression
people
as
are."
well. Because I talked to him a little bit when Crystal and Sagar first were planning to leave. Crystal and I were, talking behind the scenes about whether or not I was going to come on as her replacement before it became acrimonious.
Right,
And then when it became acrimonious, I was like, well, I don't want to be a scab. I'm not going to come in and,
right,
and take this job. Like it's too toxic. And then after time went by and there was new ownership and it became, things died down, then of course there was new ownership. But I remember I had some conversations with Finkelstein as well. And while I know he was kind of a big personality and maybe had some other quirks, he
yeah,
did seem to have an understanding of, or at least an appetite for what what was motivating the success of the show. He was
yeah,
genuinely intellectually curious about that and wanted to feed it.
right.
And that was not the environment going forward.
No, once Nexstar got there, like I said, there was like a year where we were just like, we're let loose. We could do whatever we want. And there was just rumblings of people being like, we don't, like I think Steve Clemens and Bob. That's what I know for sure that they were against me, and they would voice their opinions to the person VP who was running Rising, to the producers, then to the Daily Beast. Um, there was, but they didn't have any control. So they were kind of like, whoa, what do we do with this conspiracy theorist? And, uh, and then, yeah, I mean, when it came down to the Fauci interview, that's when Nexstar finally assigned management. So 2 weeks before that was when they finally got management from Nexstar into Rising. And then within those 2 weeks, yeah, that's when, and I was really, for me, I wasn't fired. I walked from the
Yeah.
situation. They
Yeah.
wanted me to stay. And I was like, how could I stay? How can I stay now after you guys insulted me so deeply, and the audience so deeply? Like, this is
Yeah.
just such a huge
Yeah.
insult
I
that
remember, I mean, our team, I think what people should also understand is that there's like the rising team, like the smaller bubble of people who produce the show every day. And then there was management and all these kind of outside influences. And, you know, the team understood and appreciated what you brought to the show in terms of both your worldview and obviously just your on-air talent, but also in terms of audience pull. I mean, you were regularly
yeah,
doing radars that got like 500,000 views. I mean, you were carrying the show on your back, and it felt like the indifference that management had to what it would mean to the show for you to leave, even on a pure like bottom line mercenary just money talks way, was really confusing. And we started to see that going forward as well, where like there are topics that I don't obviously agree with the audience on overwhelmingly, that I prefer, frankly, not to talk about, that I'm not as comfortable with, but which do really well for the show. And I understood, okay, suck it up, Briahna. You have to talk about X, Y, and Z because there's a certain appetite for this stuff.
yeah,
When the tables turned and the audience became really interested in Gaza from a pro-Palestine perspective, it was fascinating to me to see, again, much like in the case with you and talking about COVID stuff, that suddenly the rationale of let's talk about, you know,
anything,
a
yeah,
Joe Rogan clip or whatever it is, because
right,
that's what the audience wants, didn't apply to very substantive news about what was going on in the Middle East. And so
yeah,
no matter how well those segments performed, there was a constant fight to cover it less, to do fewer segments. I started doing more radars because it was the only way I felt like I could get news about what was going on in Gaza into the lineup.
yeah,
I had my guest requests ignored and dragged out. There was this constant pressure to have more pro-Zionist voices on. I think there was a lot of pressure on Robbie to push back against me, even if, and I'm not trying to speak for him, but my impression of him was that there were sometimes that his heart wasn't really in it, that he felt like he had to play a sort of a role as a foil because management was saying it cannot be kind of a uniformly critical of Israel voice on the show.
yeah,
And there started to be like choices that were made that frankly sabotage the entire success of the show, including not allowing us to respond to clips at one point.
hmm,
And you can imagine, you have a show. Imagine if you couldn't talk about whatever Tucker Carlson said or
right,
Joe Rogan said or They said on The View you couldn't respond to anything other than press conference clips with, Kirby or Matt Miller or whomever.
Yeah. It's just disrespect and disdain for the audience is what it boils down to, and or just ignorance, or like pure ignorance for the audience and what the audience, just management. I just not having their finger on the pulse, but they're
Yeah.
they're seeing it, so it's like, how can they not then learn from that
I don't think
and
they care. I don't
and
think,
real
although
yeah,
I will
maybe they
say
just
this.
don't. Thank you for watching this clip from the full Kim Iverson show, which you could catch just by heading to that link down below, KimIversonShow.com. You can watch the full show from what you just watched, or you could catch the full show live Monday through Friday, live streams, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern at KimIversonShow.com. See you then. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Never miss an episode. Never miss a clip. Never miss a segment. Thanks, guys.